The history of the atom started with Greek philosophers with ideas of the environment around them. Yet, one of the most important people to ever study the concept of the atom after those philosophers was John Dalton, who was one of the first scientists to ever come up with an atomic theory. His atomic theory has become the base to what we know about atoms today, and it continues into effect more than a century after his time.
Dalton was an Englishman born in 1766 in Eaglesfield, Britain, that had a Quaker background. His Quaker background and the fact that he was a very shy and modest guy prevented him from getting the recognition he deserved for his discoveries and theories.
The importance of this Dalton guy is pretty obvious, since he was one of the first scientists to ever come up with a modern atomic theory. Although people may have known that atoms existed, there was no definite proof to support it, which he supplied us with. He was also the first person to ever explain the behavior of atoms in terms of weight.
Since theories can be disproven or supported as time goes by, now some of his theory is considered to be wrong because of new discoveries. Although it may be a bit inaccurate, it has created the foundation of atoms today. The first part of his theory stated that all matter is made up of tiny particles called atoms. Atoms cannot be seen by the naked human eye and can make up solids, liquids, and gases.
The second part of his theory explains that all atoms are indestructible and unchangeable, which means they cannot divide or break and that they cannot be converted into the atoms for another element. Most of his second part of his theory was based on the law of conservation of mass, which says that mass cannot be gained or lost.
The third part of Dalton's theory describes how elements are defined by the mass of its atoms. The same type of element will have the same atom mass, and if it does not, then it is a different element because it is one set number.
The fourth part of the atomic theory specifies how a chemical reaction is simply a rearrangement of atoms, or disarray of their normal form. When elements react to outside forces, their atoms combine in simple whole number ratios.
The final part of the atomic theory explains that when elements react to form chemical bonds or compounds, their atoms sometimes combine in more than one simple whole ratio number.
Dalton was an avid scientist who loved studying the nature of gas, which was an obsession of his since day one. He had a fascination with the weather and the atmosphere, which led to his studies of gases and how they would form into liquids and solids. That would later become the foundation for his atomic theory.
Along with gas, Dalton would study the nature and the chemical makeup of air, which led him to the discovery that air was a chemical system made up of small individual particles that would get pressured by gas independently.
This guy was the master of patience. One of his experiments involved recording the weather every day for 56 years to see the patterns of fog and other weather patterns, which led him to his first hypothesis. Everything was made up of small particles called atoms.
Dalton did many experiments that required him to mix gases to find out what effects properties of the individual gases had on the properties of the mixture as a whole. He tried to cause chemical bonds and reactions to see how each gas interacted with each other. He would later try to explain why atoms would keep their weight even after they would change their form from a liquid to a solid to gas. So he theorized that atoms were indestructible and unable to change, which he found out by, you guessed it, experimenting with gases.
So hey, this Dalton guy has a lot of stuff on atomic theory, which is pretty cool, but did he have any support from other scientists or help from other scientific research? Well, the answer is yes. He built on the research of guys like Louis Proust with his law of constant composition, Anton Lavoisier who made the law of mass conservation, and a Greek philosopher named Democritus. Dalton also built on the theory of Democritus, who is also on the list of important people that contributed to the atomic theory because of his theory that matter was made up of small, hard, indivisible particles, which he called atoms. Dalton would not work with anyone else in the discovery business because he was a very shy and independent person that liked to work alone.
Oh, it's fun fact time. John Dalton did a very extensive study on color blindness because he was colorblind himself and wanted to know why. Because of his studies, he was one of the first to discover that color blindness is hereditary and got evidence by studying his own eye for research. Another fun fact is that when John Dalton was younger, he did not have a formal education because of his poverty, but he still ended up being a teacher by the age of 12. To make matters more unbelievable, he was the principal of another school by the age of 14. Dalton was such a modest guy that he even turned down membership of the Royal Society in 1822, which is a pretty big deal, and barely ended up accepting an honorary doctorate of science